All right, let's just get right into it. Think back to May of 2026. A 70-year-old diplomatic institution, literally disguised as a sparkly pop music competition, spectacularly derailed on live television. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are completely dissecting the 2026 Eurovision crisis to figure out exactly how the world's most watched cultural event fractured under, honestly, unprecedented pressure.
Now look, you already know the deal with this competition. It's supposed to be this bulletproof, glittering spectacle of soft power, right? But why was 2026 the year it just unraveled? How did a broadcast that was carefully engineered from day one to transcend borders suddenly become the exact flashpoint that tore them apart? The sheer scale and the suddenness of this shock is the puzzle we're going to solve today.
So, let's kick things off with Section 1, the 2026 Eurovision crisis.
Okay, we need to be really clear here. We're not just looking at a minor PR hiccup. This is what experts actually call a cultural fracture. That is the precise point where a massive shared event just structurally breaks under the crushing weight of internal tensions and external polarization. You see, mega events like this rely on a super delicate, unspoken consensus. And when that consensus shatters, the whole foundation simply crumbles.
But, a fracture of this scale definitely doesn't just happen overnight. We have to peel back the layers and look at the invisible cracks that were forming way before 2026. Actually, if we look closely at the European Broadcasting Union's charter, their framework for handling geopolitical disputes was notoriously vague. It basically left broadcasters to interpret these so-called non-political rules entirely on their own. And honestly, those were the very first stress fractures. Moving right along to Section 2, Institutional and Government Pressures.
Let's look at the dual pressures that were basically squeezing the organizers from both sides. On the inside, we have broadcaster tensions. We're talking about national networks fundamentally clashing over censorship protocols, arguing over airtime for controversial delegations, the whole internal logistical nightmare. Then on the outside, you've got government pressure. Ministers of culture and foreign offices were issuing top-down mandates, literally leveraging state funding to force event organizers to align with specific foreign policy stances. So you have these internal gears just fiercely grinding against an immense external political squeeze.
Which brings us to Section 3, Audience and Social Media.
Think of this dynamic kind of like tectonic plates. You've got the irresistible force of grassroots movements meeting the immovable object of institutional control. Those top-down pressures from the broadcasters and governments, they forcefully collided with bottom-up demands from highly vocal, deeply invested audiences. And when those two plates shifted against each other, the resulting friction was absolutely explosive.
And the data reveals a pretty stark reality here. The viewership was just no longer unified. The audience split into these fiercely polarized factions. Group A is rallying around absolute freedom of expression, demanding the broadcast reflect real-world global activism. Meanwhile, Group B is insisting on strict traditionalism, wanting a purely apolitical entertainment space. Imagine hosting a massive party where half the guests are staging a protest and the other half are demanding total silence. It just became mathematically and culturally impossible to unify them.
But the real catalyst that turned those segments into rigid, unmoving divisions, highly organized social media campaigns. We are talking about coordinated TikTok boycotts and mass voting manipulation orchestrated entirely through Telegram channels. Social media essentially transformed passive viewers into active, digitized combatants. It took differing opinions and weaponized them into coordinated actions that the organizers simply couldn't outpace.
All right, let's dive into Section 4, Advertising and Institutional Trust.
Because the fallout here was a true multi-front assault. We saw an immediate financial hit, severe reputational damage driven by international media, and an incredibly deep, systemic loss of institutional trust. Let's break down exactly what that damage looked like in the real world.
First up, the financial panic. Advertisers really only crave one thing above all else, and that's brand safety. Well, when the 2026 fracture hit, that safety just instantly evaporated. Major headline sponsors literally threatened to pull multi-million euro ad buys overnight because the polarization was so toxic. And look, when your primary sponsors are publicly distancing themselves, the panic is completely palpable, and the very existence of the broadcast is on the line.
Simultaneously, the whole event was hit with this overwhelming, unrelenting spotlight. I mean, how do you manage a pop music broadcast when it's suddenly leading the global news cycle on CNN and Al Jazeera? This wasn't just a fun entertainment story anymore. It was a high-stakes geopolitical crisis playing out live.
And that intense global scrutiny made it flat out impossible for the institution to quietly resolve any of its internal issues behind closed doors.
Let's zoom out a bit for Section 5, long-term cultural implications. To understand where we're going, we actually have to look backward, because the warning signs, they were absolutely there. Organizers struggled to manage intense broadcaster disputes back in 2022, and the clashes over political neutrality in 2024 were a massive, flashing red flag. But rather than overhauling the foundational rules back then, they were just treated as isolated incidents, which, of course, perfectly set the stage for the massive systemic failure we saw in 2026.
Ultimately, this isn't just about entertainment. It points to a much broader societal trend. When you have unresolved institutional tensions, it creates the perfect vulnerability. Those vulnerabilities are then exploited by polarized forces, which fractures the audience entirely. And the end result? It breeds a systemic decline in trust across the board. When we all watch a beloved 70-year-old institution stumble so publicly, our overall faith in institutional authority as a whole really takes a hit.
Which leaves us with a critical, undeniable question. Based on the crushing top-down governmental pressures, the highly coordinated social media boycotts, and the multi-million euro financial fallout, can international cultural events even survive in an era of intense polarization? It's a massive challenge, and it's definitely going to require us to completely rethink how we gather on a global scale. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep exploring the mechanics of the world around you.